Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Connolly, President and Chief Investment Officer at Versa Capital Management in Phoenix, Arizona. Thank you all for spending some time with me here this morning on November 4th. Today, I'd like to say a few words about the upcoming midterm election, and I am going to not talk too much about politics. I am going to talk a little bit about how markets have behaved around midterm elections and give you a little bit of perspective on that. So first of all, I'd like to talk about what's at stake, what's up for grabs. All 435 House of Representatives seats are available. 35 out of the 100 Senate seats are contested. And of the 50 state governorships, 36 are up for election. And a few states are voting on some consequential propositions. There are some in my home state of Arizona, and some in California, and others out east. So it's certainly a big election with a lot of consequences possible. So people ask, whether or not we should change their investments, considering what's going on in the election. And as you might guess, answers can vary widely depending on what end of the political spectrum you're on. We have clients and associates on both sides of the political spectrum, and on some other dimensions than just left and right as well. However, I'm not going to talk about who's ahead where or what the ideological drivers are behind the election. I want to just kind of look at what happens during midterm elections and how investors should think about it. How should people think around the possibility of changing investments based upon what party ends up in control? So I think I'll start with looking at more fine and granular data. So I have here a histogram that shows all the monthly returns from 1926 through the end of 1921. And the monthly returns during historical midterm elections are shown. The red is Republican, blue is Democrat, purple is mixed. The one party holds the House or Senate, and the other party holds the other chamber. And the gray are simply months in which there were no elections. And you can see that there are, the distribution is kind of random. It's very hard to discern a pattern in the return during the month of an election. However, the returns are skewed to the right, which means most of the election months are positive historically, although there are some negative ones. So during election years, such as they are, if the return for the year is positive, generally the returns are concentrated in the fourth quarter of the years in which a midterm election is held. A really interesting number that came out of some State Street research was that during the year in a midterm election, at some point during the year, there's a string of days where there's a drawdown that averages 19%. So this year we've hit 24, 25% on the downturn from the S&P 500. It's come back a little bit lately. So certainly our experience is a little worse than the average, but it's not unusual at some point during the year to have a rather large market drawdown. So let's move from the monthly to what happens following an election. Typically, after a midterm election, markets are positive. In fact, they've always been positive in the year following a midterm election. And the bulk of it happens in the 6 months following the election, where the average market return post-midterm election is 13%. And there's never been a recession in the year following a midterm election. I'm not so sure we're going to see that in 2023. There very well might be a recession. The markets are certainly have priced in some distress, whether it's from interest rates rising or liquidity being pulled back or anticipated changes in fiscal policy. We're not sure how that sorts out, but in any case, it's in the post-war period, markets have always been positive, regardless of who wins, what house or what governorship. So I'd like to, at this point, stop and make a comment on my presentation. And at the root, it's really kind of silly what I'm talking about here, because we are taking an event, an election in the midterm, a midterm election, and then we are looking at history. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about going forward, but we're talking about it just in the context of an election, just one consideration, where there are many other things going on right now. We have a war going on in the Ukraine. We're in one of the most, if not the most restrictive periods in monetary policy in history. We still have a tremendous amount of fiscal stimulus coming out of Washington in terms of a large budget deficit. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on. There are lots of other things going on in the markets right now in this year that are probably more impactful and important than this election. Now, depending where you sit on the political spectrum and your perspectives, you might feel differently. Certainly during this election, more than any time in my life, except maybe the late 60s, early 70s, passions are running very high, and people are invested emotionally as well as intellectually in this election. But Congress and the governorships in the Senate are just one of many, many factors that figure into how markets are going to behave in the short run following an election and in the long run. So let's take a look a little bit at what has happened historically. Well, surprisingly, you look at a century of returns and elections, that after the midterm elections, there's really not a discernible pattern. Markets have tended to go up. There are some ups and downs. This is a data series that shows if you invested $1 on January 1st of 1926, it grew to $10,000 right before COVID. I'm sorry, right after in 2021. And so the result here is pretty much an upward trend that does have some interruptions. Historically, you can see the Depression early on. You can see the period of inflation, and from the late 60s through 1980 that really was a stagnant period for markets. And then you can see 2008. You can see COVID. You can see the tech bubble. But the trend has been relentlessly upward for an investment in the stock market. And if you look at the colors, blue for Democrats, red for Republicans, it's really difficult to pull out a pattern of when both houses were in power, when one was in power. They say a divided Congress is good for markets, but you can see right after 2000 that wasn't the case. So there are exceptions to kind of every kind of conventional wisdom out there. But it's really difficult to see a pattern depending on who's been in charge. So it's not to say that this information isn't important or might not impact markets, because policy changes come out of Washington that it can affect markets in the long run. But it's really hard to pick out the good guys and the bad guys in these elections. So, investors, in the stock market, investors invest in businesses, companies that generate cash flows in the future. They don't invest in political parties or governors or even presidents. So keeping our eyes on fundamentals, do we, markets provide us with earnings growth, dividends, real estate pays rents, bonds pay interest. Over the long run, we pay attention to what that looks like, what inflation might be, and how much are we paying for those investments are really the important considerations going forward. So, if we have a plan that we have in place for investing and meeting goals, it's important to stick to that, because derailing it on short-term political concerns, if we're acting on information that in the past has shown rather random results, is probably a mistake. So thank you for your time today. It was enjoyable for me to have the session with you here, and I look forward to seeing you next time.